Welcome back to the Equity Matters podcast. This is your host, Addis JB3, and I did not prepare well for today's episode. I am a little frustrated because I did not charge my microphones and my phone won't work, but I was committed to recording this episode, so if the audio is a little shoddy, blame me. I will take full responsibility for what has come up. Let's start today's episode first by just, I'm glad to be back into a cadence of recording that feels natural. When I'm inspired, I want to get in the studio, aka my dining room, and when I'm not, I don't try to force it. And I think that's made a big difference in the way that I show up and the way that I present. And I would encourage others to do the same. I think it's important that we pause for a second, we slow down, we take some time to acknowledge like maybe this isn't the best time to try to force content, and I'm trying to practice what I preach truly. This week we are diving into this concept of fatherhood. And for me, I think it has to really go back a few generations, in fact. And so it's no surprise that, my name is James Bell III, which means that I'm named after my dad, who was named after his dad. And so this episode really starts for me actually in March of 1928. And that is when James Bell Sr. was born, at least to our knowledge. I think what has become very clear, at least in conversations with relatives and conversations with him, is that he was adopted and he did not actually know his parents. We know that he moved from Georgia to Michigan. He was adopted by the Bell family who took care of him. I haven't been able to find any of the Bells, so that's for another day in my genealogy research, but I haven't been able to find the people who raised my grandfather. And so much of my work is really around this concept of identity. And so I find myself asking, who am I, or how am I going to show up in these spaces? And part of the challenge for me was actually thinking about, as I was growing up, where did I come from? Like, who were my people? And it became very difficult to answer that question. I'm also thinking a lot about just kind of the relationships that fathers have with their children and what's passed on from generation to generation. And I promise I want to do this in two parts. And so this episode is really thinking about my relationship vertically, right? The relationship that I have with my father, the relationship he had with his father. And then part two, I want to talk about the relationship I have with my children, because I think it'll make for an interesting comparison. We'll see how it goes. We think about the things that our parents and our fathers pass along to us, those types of values, those strengths, the things that make us who we are. And unfortunately, one of the things I think that often comes with that is this idea of toxic masculinity, right? And it's such a buzz term. I've seen various panels and conferences where people are like, oh, what can we do to address toxic masculinity? And so I want to dive into that in a little bit more detail. We think about toxic masculinity. I want you to think about the cultural norms, the expectations that define manhood. And in many ways, it's restrictive. It's actually pretty harmful. The ways that our stereotypes and the tropes that come to mind when we think about being a man.
Man up now, let him be a man. Man up!
Well, it's like you told me. I can't teach him how to be a man.
And what that means, it has been shared with us or told to us that it's really about this idea of emotional suppression. It's this idea of putting the feelings away. You don't show feelings, especially sadness, fear. You don't show vulnerability. You want to be aggressive. You want to explore and exploit in many ways your dominance. It's an aversion to anything that could be perceived as female and female/feminine. I don't know how this came to be for me, but in thinking a lot about kind of the historical context, like why would people want to display this idea of toxic masculinity to separate themselves from others. And I realize a lot of it is probably baked into this notion of survival. I think about what it means to be an enslaved person, and if you display this fear or if you display this vulnerability, you were more likely to be exploited in different ways. And I think what happens is when you show those types of traits now, the same thing is true. I'm concerned because of the way that it shows up in generation and generation. And I go back again to my grandfather. We didn't have maybe the best relationship, despite me being named after him. It wasn't one of those like call granddad, let's go fishing type relationships. Actually, we didn't talk that much at all. In many cases, when we went to his house, a lot of it was he was sitting on the front porch. He was usually antisocial from the function, but that was who he was, and I've come to appreciate that that is who he was. But it, in many ways, cut off the opportunity to learn more about who he was or what he experienced or what he encountered. And I think it shows up now in the relationship that I have with my own father. And it's been one where those idea of sharing one's feelings can be really difficult. I still find myself at times having a very hard time articulating how I'm feeling, why I'm feeling the way that I am. And it's because I did not get the same type of, I don't want to say lessons or training, but it was never modeled for me in a way that I completely understood. I'm thankful for the opportunity of going to therapy and learning how to describe my feelings and not just say I'm good, but really dig into the I feel this way. And I think being able to name those helps in this art or this science of reclaiming masculinity and redefining it, because what's been shared with us for so long is you don't cry, you just do. And I think in many ways it's got us fucked up. I think that's probably the easiest way that I could say it. But this notion of toxic masculinity, I want to keep going, is really introduced this over excessive emphasis on self-reliance and independence.
Don't worry about me. I'm a man.
I'm good.
One of the things that I think I say perhaps far too often, even right now, is that, oh, I'll just do it myself. I'll figure it out. I got it. I can do it. And I think it's so contrary to what community is or what community means, because when one person tries to take the brunt of all of these things, it doesn't lend itself to creativity, diversity of thought, innovation. It is literally you who may already be burnt out or in a situation where they're not able to perform at their best, trying to extend. And you're not willing to admit that you might actually be struggling. You're not willing to admit that things are difficult for you right now. And now you face this idea or result of isolation, or you don't find yourself in a place where you can admit that things are not going the way that you would like, because you haven't been taught to articulate those emotions. My father was the oldest brother of 9 children. He falls somewhere in the middle. And I think about, because he didn't have the best relationship with his dad, the way that it was always shared with me was that, he called his dad by his first name. And even watching growing up, he said James Bell. And it was like, wow, like you're not even calling your dad dad. And he took on a responsibility of, I hate the phrasing of like being the man of the house, but he was very much so the oldest boy and had a lot more responsibility than the others, which included taking care of his siblings. I know at one point one of my uncles actually lived with him as they got older, but just put together the scene of being the oldest boy and those responsibilities. I'm also the oldest boy, and so I take this kind of, we have to figure things out. We have to make sure our people are good. Those are things that we take seriously. And there's still trouble with that, because now we've removed the opportunity for people to play, to explore, to imagine. And we've replaced them with adult responsibilities when our brains are not even fully developed. And what happens then? I feel almost like you age more rapidly because you haven't had a chance to slow things down, to play and to just dream and to be curious. And again, we think about this notion of being the oldest and also being a man, that you're always strong. And I can't count on my fingers at all how many times I've seen my father cry, even at both of his parents' funerals. And it's an unfair assessment to think that people have to cry at funerals, but I did not see any type of emotion. And I think part of that is just the ways that we've been modeled, or the ways that we've been told how we're supposed to react to things. And I didn't quite know what vulnerability meant as a man until an adult. I remember there was this time I was playing in our basement. We didn't have carpet in the basement. We had just like a cement slab. I was trying to balance on a ball. Don't ask me why. And I fell. I hit my head. And I ran upstairs to my mother, who could see that I was obviously in distress, but I couldn't vocalize the feeling, and I couldn't let the tears fall, because if I did so, I wouldn't be a man. And I had to be like 6 or 7 at the time, but these are the types of things that become indoctrinated within you. And again, you can't show that you're vulnerable. As I've gotten older and I've taken more of a responsibility of my dad's caregiving, he's getting older himself, I have seen him be more vulnerable. And there was an incident a few years ago. I was probably in high school, where my brother and I were at a restaurant with our dad, and he fell. And he was trying to step over some chairs that were crossed over each other, and he didn't quite make it. And I wrote a short story about it, and this look that I saw in his face, this almost fear that he had been exposed in a way that showed me that he was human. And it actually meant a lot to me to see that, one, he was almost in pain, he was in distress, but also that you don't have to be Superman all the time. I admire the soft sides of him, because for so long it was kind of this rugged, it was I have to be all the time, this constant like DMX almost. And you start to see clips of DMX even later in life, watering orchids and spending time outside. And rest in peace to Brother Earl. I want that for all of us. I want all of us to understand that we don't have to be that person all the time. And even most recently, I've had to go with my father to some appointments. And there's moments where I'm not sure who I'm going to meet on the other side of the door. When I go to pick him up, I'm not sure who I'm going to be dealing with that day, because there's still times where he reverts back to kind of the way that he was indoctrinated, that I'm unfazed by all of the things. And then there's the moments where reality sets in, that he's a 64-year-old black man who's made some poor decisions in his life, who is now dealing with the consequences of said decisions, and we have to navigate those. I don't know what the future holds, obviously, but I'm hoping that as time goes on, we continue to soften a bit. I think that it's okay for us to talk about the ways that we are feeling, the ways that we are interacting within our systems, within our support systems. I had the wonderful opportunity of going to Salt Lake City last month to celebrate one of my frat brothers, my deuce, my back, who is getting married in a few weeks. And I was amongst his community, the people that support him, and the way that the weekend was facilitated, we were able to really share like who we are, where we come from, what's important to us, what's our values. And when you think of like a traditional bachelor party, you tend to think of strippers and money and drugs and all the other things. And this was very restorative for me, actually. We went axe throwing. We sat around and talked about our purpose. Shout out my man Mark Trumbo. And we were able to really dig into like who we are right now and who we want to be in the future. And so much of that for me is about looking back. I mean, I've spent so many times on episodes talking about where I come from and these pieces that I'm putting together. Even today, sharing, that my grandfather was adopted. But I think a lot of it is, I come from survivors. I come from people who were forced into roles that require physicality and endurance. And I think pairing that with masculinity, this idea of like physical toughness, of emotional suppression, those are survival mechanisms. But I don't think that the plan was for me to always have to be in survival mode. I don't think I had to always be in this overly resilient space. I think now in 2024, I think I want to be able to demonstrate vulnerability. I think there's so much more that I have to offer when I am actually my softened self. So this notion of hyper masculinity, I think it dehumanizes us. It takes away our identities. I think it adds in many ways this notion of brutality that we are not supposed to be. This notion that black men are just inherently strong and resilient, I think is going to entrench many toxic traits. So as fathers, we have to be in a place to disrupt that. We have to be in a place to say, I can be a man and be vulnerable at the same time.
Are you sure about that?
I have 3 sons and 1 daughter, and I'm trying to be the most consistent father for all of them. It's not you get to be soft for baby girl and you have to be all the time for your oldest. I'm learning, and I said I was gonna split these episodes up. I gotta keep them separate. But the same type of softness that my daughter requires, my son requires also. And I want to make sure that I'm providing that for both. And he needs to see those things. He needs to know. And so, again, going back, right? I keep going back. This idea that we had to be overly resilient, to be independent, it comes from a place that we shouldn't have to be in anymore. I don't want to find myself wrestling with the notion of always being on. And it makes me think about the work of Dr. Joy DeGruy at post-traumatic slave syndrome. Like, what other behaviors and values and ideas are we holding on to well into the 21st century? And why is it always rooted back to some type of institutionalized racism? Well, because toxic masculinity to me is actually a form of white supremacy. It's something that was put onto us. You go back into the history books, you don't see this type of behavior. You see community, you see people being able to express themselves, people taking pride in who they are and where they come from. But when you introduce toxic masculinity, I think it strips all of those things away. I don't have a good way to segue this episode, but pause here. We're going to pick back up next week, and I want to talk about how we show up as black men for our children. So let's do the podcast things. Make sure you subscribe. I'm on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. Make sure that you like if you see content on Instagram. That's at Equity Matters Podcast. I've let Twitter go for a while just because I don't need another thing to try to keep up with. Share this episode. Share this episode with a dad, someone who you think knows what it means to show up as their authentic selves, but also understands that it's okay to turn down that independence, that self-reliance. It's okay to ask for help. Send this episode to them. And last but not least, continue to share this discourse, this dialogue, because if anything, it goes to show that even for me, as I've been doing the podcast now, I tried to find a way to think about, well, how does this tie back to equity? How does this tie back to equity? All of these spaces that we occupy right now, one of the greatest barriers that we encounter can be the ideas that we have, that we've been placed upon, the mindsets that we carry. And if you truly believe in systems change, you think about it in different conditions and different ways that it happens. One of the ways that we change systems is by changing the discourse that we share with others and also the one that we share with ourselves. And so even as I challenged myself, or I was experiencing challenges earlier today, trying to get the episode going, I wasn't going to record because I didn't have my microphone. It took me a while to get to the space the way that I wanted it to. I think it's okay to roll with set punches. And as we continue to disrupt barriers, that we continue to push isolation out of the way, we can start to change the systems that we've been trying to change for so long. And so today we're starting with mindset. Later we can be talking about resources. We can talk about policies and programs. All of those things are true. But right now I want to use the podcast as a vehicle for introducing new train of thought, new ways of considering ideas, because what other place to start than with yourself? And so until next time, folks, you know where to find me. It's at SJB3, and this is Equity Matters.
When I first started growing orchids, I thought they needed the most expensive soil and lights to blossom, and they died. That's when I realized that all they really needed was time and attention.